The future of capitalism, as Evan said, is a big subject. And I think, on the whole, at least to begin with, it deserves a big picture answer. And that means, I think, above everything else, standing back. I think we're very much still at the car crash stage of analysis. We're so angry with the driver that we've forgotten exactly where we were going. We've discovered whether it was the right place or not, and whether the car was any good. I think we need to step back, and that means, I think, particularly pondering three questions. The first is, where were we going? Was that actually in the right direction? Was that a good thing? The second question is, what has actually gone wrong? What caused the crash, in a sense? And the third question, which flows from those, is which direction are we likely to go in? And there, for me, I think there is a fundamental gap between what I believe to be the right direction to go in and what I fear is the direction we might well drive towards. So we start with where we're going. And once again, we only have time for brief generalizations, but I think if you looked at the past 25 years before this crash happened, I think it was dominated by one big fact, and that is globalization. I think when historians write their chapters dealing with the world from 1970 all the way through to 2008 or 2007, they're not going to call it something like the war on terror or any of the other phrases which have been thrown up. They're going to call it something like the great opening up, the re-emergence of Asia, or something similar. And what happened during that period was it was a period when the world began to open up its economies, when capitalism began to become less fettered. And the result was, and I think we have to face this, as we saw one of the most remarkable transformations the world has ever seen. You can see that in the numbers. Developing economies surged from their share of exports from 20% to 43%. Nowadays, they consume over half the world's energy, as we know, and the Chinese are very keen on pointing this out. They hold 70% of the world's foreign exchange reserves. And this growth actually was pretty widely spread. It wasn't just the so-called BRICS. If you look at the numbers for Africa as well, you see something jumping forward in a big way. And it's true, if you look at this, the emerging world is still much poorer than we are. If you look at the number of households with more than $10,000 of income, America's got 100 million of those, and China's got barely 10. But what has happened, I think this is the really big story about what capitalism has been about, if you try and look at it from a kind of global perspective, is that something dramatic happened in terms of billions of people, or certainly a billion people, who are still poor by Western standards, but whose lives have changed dramatically over that period. They've moved from what people thought of as subsistence to what now counts as a form of middle class. If you look at the number of people earning $3 to $13 a day, or that's roughly kind of $1,200 to $10,000 to $5,000 on an annual basis, this used to be a third of the world's population. Now it's closer to a half. And you look at that in terms of what they are. It's 1 billion people have jumped out of what one would have thought of as absolute poverty. These are the people who are now spending money on their children's education, electricity, household appliances, and the top end buying scooters and cars. And the interesting thing about it is you look at it, and the numbers are just beginning to come. It's not a gradual process. I'm not going to try and describe charts too graphically. But if you look at income distribution, it tends to be like a bell-shaped. There's a huge blob in the middle. You look at a country like China, back in 1980, virtually everyone, other than a tiny Maoist elite, was below that middle class. Go to 1980, go to 2000, a few of them moved in. Go to 2005, a vast amount have moved past. I think it's worth saying three things about this. The first is, I think it's worth, above all else, remembering that billion people, that huge jump forward in terms of freedom, because it is actually freedom. When people start talking about capitalism only being about Fred Goodwin and the inhabitants of Goldman Sachs, and that leap forward is not just economic. Go to China, and yes, you see the economy growing fast, but you also see political freedom, at least under most dimensions, going further forward. Not as fast as any of us would want, but still a big deal. My second point is that this is a comeback. This is a re-emergence, not an emergence. Until the late 18th century, China and India were the world's two biggest economies before the steam engine and the power loom gave Britain its industrial lead. Today's emerging markets dominated world output. If you look up the 18 centuries up to 1820, what we now think of as the developing world produced on average 80% of world GDP, and then they were left behind by the first wave of globalization. My third point about this world is it wasn't This is not a world of unfettered capitalism. For the past 2 decades, if you look back at it, the public sector has grown just about everywhere, even in the lands of Thatcher and Reagan. And state power hasn't been lessened. Don't believe any of that junk you read about how 50 of the world's biggest countries are corporations. That's just based on bogus numbers. The state is still an amazingly powerful actor, and as you can see, played a huge role in this crisis. But in general, the state stepped back during that period. In general, the state stepped back and gave capitalism more room than it had before. What has happened over the past 25 years was not just, I think this is crucial, was not just a matter of technology and some kind of economic logic. It was the result of political decisions. I think it's worth noting that, yes, if the world opened up and if the biggest gains were to places in the third world, perhaps, I think on the whole, most Britons gained as well. I'm not denying that median incomes haven't moved in the way that we hoped they would, but I cannot think actually of any developed country which has done so well out of that global age as Britain. Thanks to Thatcherism, we moved to high-end manufacturing and services. We are still, look at the numbers, we're still the place which is happiest with free trade. We're happiest with foreigners coming to buy our companies or coming to migrate here. I'm not claiming that London is perfect. There's all sorts of problems here, and for every happy Czech waitress you meet in Covent Garden, there are several unhappy Muslim youths in Lewisham. But I would submit that during the course of that period, we have done unimaginably better than how we thought it might have been 25 years ago. So that, in a sense, is where we were going. That was the momentum towards which we were pushing. And I have to confess, rather obviously, that I'm in favor of it, because I think that was proof that liberalism worked. The same tradition from which both Vince and I spring, the same philosophy of open markets and open minds that gave birth to Gladstone and The Economist, that was what was propelling the world forward. That now brings me back to my second question. What went wrong? Because it plainly has gone wrong. GDP's fallen off a cliff. World trade's contracting for the first time since 1982. FDI has suddenly shrunk gigantically in the third world. And I think what's happened basically is there are 4 cycles spinning around. There's a financial crisis, there's an economic crisis, there's a political crisis, an ideological one. And the difficulty is that each one of those is spinning and compounding the others. It definitely began as a financial crisis, particularly that moment when Lehman went down. And I should admit up front that that financial crisis was partly caused by that world I just described. We would not have had a financial crisis without all the emerging world reserves pouring into Western markets. The $60 trillion of credit default swaps was always a bad idea, but that wouldn't have happened without $5 trillion of money coming from the emerging market. What happened was when things went wrong, they went to the politicians, and particularly that moment when Paulson went to Congress and said, here is a plan to rescue the world. And the plan was flawed. What was interesting was that Congress looked at it and said, we don't like the idea of bailing out bankers. We still think Main Street is divorced from Wall Street. We don't buy the idea that saving bankers is going to have an effect. And that turned out, I think, to be the first of many mistakes, because almost immediately an economic crisis ensued from that first financial crisis. And that economic crisis is plainly still getting worse. We have a giant version of what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. It makes sense for every one of you, for all the companies as well that many of you work for, to hoard cash at the moment. But the net result of everyone not spending is that everything keeps on getting worse. And as the economic crisis keeps on whirling around, that has 2 effects. First, it pushes back into the financial crisis. Suddenly, all the banks have got much worse toxic loans than they thought they had before. And the secondly is it's spun off into a new level of crisis, which is the political crisis. Most obviously, this is political. Most obviously, this is domestic. Go to America, and you see plenty of Congress people who, even if we now tend to regard Obama's coronation as more or less inevitable, they remember very well that McCain was either level pegging or ahead as it went into that week when Lehman collapsed and Americans got their 401k plans. And they remember that each time a bill comes through to bail out bankers. Or look at China, which I mentioned earlier. There, the government hopes for 7% growth in order to maintain stability. What happens if that goes? Or for that matter, consider what's happening in our own country. Look at the leadership race, which has basically sparked off within the Labour Party the moment that the economy began to tie into brown. So in every country, I think, there is a domestic political crisis brewing, But I think the one you really have to worry about if you're thinking about the future of capitalism is not what's happening inside countries, it's what's happening between them. If you look particularly at the moment, if you look at the land to the east of Germany, all that space between Berlin and Vladivostok, you see the beginning of a debt crisis. And the people who are going to have to pay to sort that out are the people in this room. Because in the end, the European Union is going to be the one who's going to have to go and bail out people. And once you consider the political price of politicians wandering around saying, not only has Joe the plumber nicked your job, but you're going to have to pay for his mortgage because he can't pay for it as well. Not Joe the plumber, the Polish plumber. Joe the plumber was a different one. I think you see the impact that could have. Or look at the spat between America and China. You see that what could imagine go wrong in terms of the reactions to Geithner's speech. America feels the dragon's breath on its shoulder in a way that I think Europe does not. And China now wants to respond as an equal. It sees it fundamentally as a G2 world, not as a G20 world. So all these crises, this financial crisis, this economic crisis, this political crisis, they're all shaping the future state of capitalism. But the biggest debate, I still think, is ideological. And that really comes down to one question. How capitalist, how free do we want to be? And there's no shortage of people, I think, at the moment, insisting that they don't want to be that at all. You saw that early on when Nicolas Sarkozy declared that laissez-faire was dead. Last week I went and saw one of Europe's leading politicians who, when I mentioned casually the word capitalism, said, oh, don't use that, it's a toxic word. We now try and use the word market economy instead, because you can't sell capitalism as a concept. I think we have to divide this stage, this coming battle, into two parts. The first question is it right? Is it correct that people are beginning to reconsider capitalism? And the second is, how dangerous is it? On is it right, I obviously stand on one side, but I think there's basically a broad, bad argument to be had about globalization in general, and there's a narrow, worthwhile one to be had about finance. The broad, weak one is that capitalism as a whole has failed. That, I think, is bunk, given all the stuff I talked about earlier. The narrow financial one is much more complicated. First, even economic liberals have accepted that during banking crises, governments have to intervene. One of my more famous predecessors, Walter Bagehot, was the guy who first recommended that the Bank of England should come in and lend money at penalty rates to illiquid banks. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, those two esteemed socialists, both nationalized banks. We've argued that Gordon Brown should have nationalized Northern Rock much earlier, and the same for Fannie and Freddie. Indeed, you could argue both Obama and Brown's failure to be able to grasp the concept of nationalization is now a weakness. I think the same goes for regulation. Nobody wants unregulated finance. A world which ended up with, as I said, $62 trillion of credit default swaps, or $10 trillion of bank-like assets in America which weren't actually in banks. By any definition, not even the most liberal libertarian could imagine that was sensible. But be careful, I think, fundamentally, about blaming it all on deregulation. The epicenter of the current mess, the very, very core of what went wrong, the American mortgage market, was perhaps the most regulated part of the whole finance industry. It's dominated by two government industries, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and guided by congressional schemes to increase home ownership. And you look at the macroeconomic conditions which set this off. That was caused by governments deciding to do things. It was caused by China deciding to keep its hold down its exchange rate. And it was caused also by America's decision to keep on keeping interest rates where they were. I think also there's evidence that markets, and I say this very gently because it always goes down particularly badly, markets do correct themselves, and that is beginning to happen again. Derivatives are moving on to exchanges. Banks are shredding riskier assets. That is simply what capitalism does. There is not, from that perspective, a huge need for a massive rewrite of capitalism for my book. Yes, you need things like counter-cyclical capital requirements, and we can discuss those. And yes, you need central banks to take asset prices into account. And yes, you need to force banks to account for bonuses properly. But on the whole, I would aim for better government, not more government. So that is what I think the right answer to the future state of capitalism is. But my head tells me, sadly, that that is unlikely to happen. I think if you look forward, regardless of what is right, capitalism is going to be a more restricted animal in at least 5 ways. Most obviously, the public sector and its debt will take up a bigger portion of the economy in many countries. That's probably a good thing in the short term because the fiscal stimulus is what we need, but somebody will have to pay for it, and it'll probably be capitalism. Next, I think protectionism and economic nationalism are on the rise. Politicians are pouring taxpayers' money into banks, but insisting essentially that they lend as much as possible to that at home. Regulators are also doing the same. In Switzerland, you get extra points, or you get extra capital, so to speak, if you lend money at home, but not if you take abroad. Overseas, you're beginning to see the beginning of Buy American clauses in America. You may actually today, it's just possible that this today may be the day when some form of economic war started with this fuss about Mexican trucks, which is where Obama has let through a piece of legislation which will penalize Mexicans trying to truck things through under NAFTA. The third level are all those missed opportunities, all those times where people might have argued for deregulation in, say, health and education, but won't now. The fourth is mission creep, all those politicians who say, yes, we just took over banks because we understand. We're not like Mitterrand in 1981. We understand that we don't want to run banks, but they keep on getting drawn in. They start having to set pay, they start having to set levels of management who they lend to, and then it turns from banks to cars and so on. You have to be a very brave American president to wander up and tell the 266,000 people at General Motors why they shouldn't get any government money, whilst the 45,000 well-paid folk at Morgan Stanley got 10 billion. And finally, I think there is an element now of bash the rich. I think the Fred Goodwin stuff here, whatever his many, many sins, is a good example. Obama also, most of his budget is now based on the idea that the top 10% are going to pay ever more. From all those perspectives, I think, and this is where I'll end, is I think the future of capitalism is at something of a fork. On the one hand, yes, there is a chance of things getting better really rather quickly. That is because I think some assets now look outrageously cheap. I looked at something last week which pointed out the US market has only been cheaper for 26 months in the past 140 years, and most of those are during depression or wartime. It's also because I have an enduring faith in that billion people in the emerging world who I think will continue to pester and push things forward. But I think at the same time, there's also a danger of things gradually getting worse. And that, I think, is the one which you should think about whenever you hear tiny instances of things being pushed forward. You can see that in the tension between China and America. You can see that in the economic nationalism which is rising. For all those who imagine that globalization is somehow so irreversible that really you're just playing with the margins, I'd invite you to go and read John Maynard Keynes's description of a Londoner in 1913 who sits there lying in bed, ordering things from around the world with this wonderful new capitalist system, via the wonderful new gadget of the telephone, the telegraph, rushing off to go and get things and having them delivered to his house. And the fact, which Keynes repeatedly re-emphasizes, is he expected this to be utterly normal and to continue forever, because surely there was no way in which this could ever be derailed. And if you look at those two futures, maybe one gradually shifting it towards protectionism, a very different form of capitalism, and you look at the other, whereby something begins to come back, and yes, no doubt there would be mistakes in it, I think a lot depends, a huge amount depends, not sadly on Gordon Brown, but on the man who comes here in 2 weeks, and that is Obama. I think when historians look back on his presidency, they will ask two questions. The first was, did he save capitalism broadly, as it is at the moment? And the second, which is tied heavily into it and is tied into what I began with, is did he manage to bring the emerging powers, that huge portion of the world, into the world order? Because by the time he leaves office in 2017, if he serves two terms, it is very difficult to imagine that countries like China, India, Brazil won't want a bigger seat at the table. And those two things, I think, come together. It offers Obama an amazing opportunity to forge something new, because it is not just about institutions, it's also about ideas. He has to convince the world that an Anglo-Saxon version of the world is not just capitalism immediately associated with Lehman Brothers and not justice immediately associated with Guantanamo Bay. Obama brings amazing assets in that battle, but at the same token, you look and see what happened with the Mexican truckers today. You look and imagine, I don't think Barack Obama is a protectionist. I think he would try to stop a China-bashing bill. getting through Congress. I think he would do everything possible not to sign it. But in an environment where America is still in deep trouble, in an environment where the unions are angry and where people are pushing forward, in an environment where he's failed to get healthcare through, an environment where there are still millions of people without jobs, he might just sign it, thinking, well, the Chinese can take this. And then I think you have a very different version of what capitalism might come to. So yes, remain optimistic, but at the same time, be very aware about what's at stake and what could be lost. And that is my version of the future.